that reversed a century of colonial superiority.
Britain's position in Malaya rested more than anything else on British prestige. And if British authorities admitted to Chinese civilian leaders that they needed help, that would raise troubling questions about British prestige and the British ability to protect Singapore. Only the threat of defeat by the Japanese really dispelled that kind of reluctance.
The Chinese in Singapore had a long-standing hatred of the Japanese, stretching back to Japan's brutal invasion of China. And the men of Dal Force were prepared to die fighting them.
There would be Chinese nationalists, communists, and of course there'd be mixed motives. There were some local Chinese who had affinities, with this place, those who were born here. Some had been here for centuries, perhaps. But I would say the majority of them counted China as their homeland. And China was, of course, engaged in this life and death struggle with Japanese forces since 1937.
Percival's ragtag multinational army amounted to 85,000 troops. It comprised a corps of experienced but weary soldiers who'd retreated from the fighting in Malaya, supported by untrained or unmotivated new recruits.
There was those soldiers left over from fighting, they're the remnants with reinforcements, some who couldn't even put a bullet in a rifle. Honest to goodness, that was right.
Although outnumbered with just 36,000 troops, Yamashita's men were all battle-hardened and single-minded.
天皇を立てまつらないかんということでですね、から天皇陛下のためなら国のために命を捧げるという昔そういう気が前でみんな言っておりましたからね。そういう気持ちで国のために頑張ろうと思って行ったわけですね。
In early February, Yamashita began his assault on Singapore's defences. He launched a devastating artillery bombardment and relentless air attacks.
My father decided that we should sleep in the air raid shelter because the bombing and the shelling was getting really bad. Bombs were bursting overhead and all that, so I think we should go to the air raid shelter under the house. And that's where we stayed. And of course the next morning when I went up to my room, and that's what I discovered. The shrapnel right in the middle of my pillow where my head would have been. So I had a lucky escape.
With the Japanese launching 2 and often 3 air raids a day, nearly 1,000 civilians were killed during January and early February of 1942.
I saw people dying on the road, people were injured, and building on fire and crumbling.
The bombing was shattering the long-held faith in the British Empire among the locals.
At 8 a.m. that morning, I went to school to sit my final exam. And the papers was history about the British Empire. So I thought, well, ironic, here we have the bombs falling, we're talking about British Empire.
The modern Japanese Air Force had all but destroyed the Commonwealth's mainly obsolete fighter planes, and the skies now belonged to the Japanese. Percival concentrated on Singapore's land defences. The British pride and joy were Singapore's 15-inch naval guns, but they were pointing the wrong way. In a growing list of defensive errors, British planners assumed any attack on the island would come from the sea to the south.
The British made lots of assumptions about the Japanese that weren't true. They assumed that the Japanese couldn't fight, they assumed that their equipment was rubbish, they assumed that they'd come from the sea and attack Singapore Island directly. So the British really lost out because they made assumptions, both racial and technological and tactical and strategic, and almost every single one of those assumptions proved to be false.
Percival managed to hurriedly swing some of the guns around to fire on the Japanese massing at Johor. But they had the wrong ammunition. It was designed to fire at ships and inflicted little damage on the troops. General Percival thought Yamashita would attack in force to the east of the causeway and move 12,000 British and Indian troops to Serangoon to face them.
When we got to Serangoon, somebody had strung some wire up, but very little else.
Wouldn't stop a bloody fox terrier.
In case Yamashita had a different plan, Percival asked the commander of the Australian forces, Major General Gordon Bennett, to send 6,000 of his troops to the other side of the island. The Australians were to defend a 12-mile wide stretch of mangrove swamps to the west of the causeway. 2,000 of Bennett's men were the untrained new recruits. Defending this expansive coastline would be a near impossible task.
It was hopeless. We had about, a mile of coastline that we were supposed to look after. It had nothing, no barbed wire, no slip trenches, no nothing. And it was just an open invitation for the Japanese to come and take the island.
The 1,000 Chinese volunteers of Dalforce joined the Australians on the beachhead. They'd completed their training just 3 days earlier. From his vantage point on the mainland, General Yamashita had a clear view of the Empire forces' positions. The master strategist readied his troops to land on Singapore Island. He chose the sparsely defended Australian and Dalforce position, where the straits were at their narrowest.
Two Australians swam out into the straits there between it and came back with the information that Japanese were preparing boats in that area. And the British wouldn't said, no, they're going to land up at the other end. They've got a lot of traffic running up and down there.
There was a lot of traffic heading towards the northeast, but it was part of General Yamashita's plan to fool Percival into believing he would attack the large British force positioned there.
夜間トラックをライトをつけて、西から東に走らせるんです。そして今度ライト消して戻ってくることを一晩何回もするんです。でそれでとにかく日本軍の部隊が西から東に移動しているということをですね、数日間続けるんですね。
On the 7th of February, Yamashita sent troops on a diversionary attack to fire across the water at the main British position to further convince Percival he was going to land there. Indian soldiers fought alongside the Japanese in this attack. These were men who deserted the British Empire forces in Malaya to form a new unit, the Indian National Army.
Some of them did it because their mates were doing it. Some of them did it because they were furious with the Brits who they thought had let them down. Some of them did it because they were die-hard anti-imperialists who wanted to drive the British out of India as soon as possible by whatever means available.
Their commander was the anti-British nationalist, Captain Mohan Singh. In this action, Indian soldiers, for the first time in the campaign, fired on their former colonial masters. The next night, 13,000 Japanese soldiers embarked on the 6-minute crossing of the Straits of Johor. With Percival still convinced the attack would come on the northeast, the Japanese quietly headed towards the Australian and Dalforce troops spread thinly along the west coast.
あそこはジョホの水道であまりその時は波がなかったものですから順調に敵の攻撃を受けずに突破できました。
They landed exactly where the British didn't think they were going to land, opposite the Australians.
The Australians had little chance of stopping the huge numbers of Japanese pouring in. Dalforce soldiers fought bravely, but some were armed with only machetes or shotguns. Most would die here on the beaches.
Frankly, they were absolutely no match whatsoever for the combat-hardened Japanese infantry that came at them, and come at them they did. The Japanese brushed them aside. These were brave men who, going up against some of the toughest combat infantrymen in the world, deserve our respect, but they were never going to be anything more than a speed bump.
Outnumbered 2-1, the pressure became far too much. The Japanese broke through, gaining a foothold on Singapore Island, forcing the Australians into a hasty retreat. The so-called impregnable fortress had been breached. In just over a day, the Commonwealth forces had lost control of the causeway and the entire western side of the island.
Shot S100.
I run the shop here, okay?
Building yourself!
A family that builds together, battles together.
If you had a clue as to what you were talking about, you'd be dangerous.
I get it done.
Listen.
You around. Who cares? It just aggravates me to death. You know what I'm saying?
American Chopper, tomorrow night on Discovery Channel.
So many stackers, so much fun.
So good!
Wen used to think that all toothbrushes were the same. But then I suggested he switch to the Oral-B Cross Action Pro Health. Its superior crisscross bristles remove up to 99% of unhealthy plaque. For the confidence of a cleaner mouth, get the Oral-B Cross Action Pro Health.
Bright skin is every woman's dream. We want it smooth and firm. Is it asking too much to want radiance too?
SK2's Facial Treatment Essence improves all 5 dimensions of skin for crystal clear results.
Smooth. Doing doing. Fair. I feel wonderful.
Engage anyone, anytime, anywhere. For advertising opportunities, call StarHub Media Network at 6825-7628 or email to mediasales@starhub.com.
On the 9th of February, General Yamashita felt confident enough to cross onto the island, setting up his headquarters in time to see the first prisoners taken in the siege.
Sir, there's a cable here.
The next day, a cable from Winston Churchill revealed the cold-hearted self-interest of British colonialism.
There must at this stage be no thought of saving the troops or sparing the population. The battle must be fought to the bitter end, at all costs. The honor of the British Empire and the British Army is at stake.
The survival of the civilian population, the native population, the troops in Singapore was secondary, really, to the point of honour at stake here, which was the preservation of the British citadel in Asia. Churchill was quite prepared to sacrifice some 1 million people on the island of Singapore to Japanese artillery and Japanese invasion. He did explicitly say, fight to the last man, meaning the last civilian, as well as the last soldier.
Percival left more than half his army sitting idle on the northeast coast, while the Australian and Dalforce troops took the brunt of the attack. After 3 full days, he finally realised he'd been tricked. and ordered them across the island to support the retreating Australians, who were now being driven back towards Singapore town.
The Australians were coming back through the jungle. It was throwing down with rain, and I'm standing under a palm tree with a gas cape, one of the waterproof capes on me. And the Australians were saying, you know, get out, you want to get out because the Japs are right behind us. And in the finish we found out we were in the front line.
At Bukit Timah, the bruised and battered British Empire Army, plagued by desertions and riven with discontent, made a determined stand. As the battle wore on into the night, the fanaticism of the Japanese soldiers shocked the Empire troops.
戦友がそばに倒れ向こうでやられたって言うてもですね、しっかりしようって手でもう今度は自分がまだ命ある限り突っ込まないかんというような気持ちで、戦闘状態におる時の人間心というものはもうないですね。
In the end, the Empire forces at Bukit Timah had to yield to the fanatical Japanese soldier. It finally dawned on them that they were fighting an enemy who was at least their equal.
We were told that they can't see, they can't fight. They're all paddy wallopers, we called them. The biggest surprise of our life, I think, when it... And then especially when we were immediately told we were going to withdraw.
By the 14th of February, the Japanese were overlooking the city. 1 million people were trapped within a radius of 3 miles. Singapore's very fabric was being torn apart.
I would not have wanted to be in Singapore town. That must have been the worst place on the planet to be at that time. The Japanese were terror bombing and bombarding the town to try and provoke mass civilian panic and buckle the defenses. They were bombing from the air and shelling with heavy artillery, and all indiscriminately.
Well over half the city's water supply was going to waste through broken pipes.
I remember my father saying to my mother, "We're going to lose this war. If it's the last thing I do, I've got to get you off the island." Unfortunately, in the middle of all this, he went down with malaria and was transferred to the Alexandra Hospital in Singapore.
Alexandra Hospital was the British military hospital and lay in the path of the Japanese advance. The hospital, built to accommodate 550 patients, was packed with 900 sick and wounded soldiers.
I saw these soldiers, blood oozing from their bandages. Many had head wounds, I think.
At 2:30 p.m. on the 14th of February, retreating Indian troops used the hospital as cover to fire on the Japanese as they advanced towards the city.
My father said, "Go home, pack a box and be ready to leave. I'm taking my discharge from hospital." And then a truck took us down to the docks and the ship was packed with women and children. The ship finally managed to get away from the harbour. And I can remember waving to my father, who by this time seemed to be all alone on the dock.
As the ship was leaving, a Japanese company in full battle gear charged into the hospital looking for the Indian troops. Finding them gone, they rampaged through the wards, killing at least 100 defenceless patients.
They went in and baited and slaughtered doctors, nurses, patients, even patients on the operating table.
As the final moments approached, the Japanese bombing and shelling took its toll on the civilian population.
It was horrifying to think that there were so many bits and pieces. There were still people dying. Some of them already dead. There were a lot of broken limbs about. It was the smell of blood, I think, and smoke that really got to me. And I just couldn't believe that all this could happen.
With the world crumbling around them, the British were desperate to escape. The evacuation of Singapore revealed damning evidence of the British view of their Asian subjects. Of the 10,000 women and children who were evacuated, 7,000 were white.
The Europeans are declaring, if you like, that they really don't belong here by their conduct. And that leaves the Singaporeans on the quayside looking at the ships leaving, scratching their heads and thinking, who really has a stake in this country? And the answer is they do.
Those left stranded on the wharf were condemned to face the fearsome occupying force now at the gates of their city.
Did you know your brain is constantly working? That's why you're able to hear the alarm clock when you are supposed to be sleeping. That's just one amazing fact about your brain. There's still many cognitive functions that remain a mystery. Brands, in an effort to gain more insights into how the brain works, established the Brands Brain Research Centre. Scientists investigate the mechanisms behind how their products work to improve brain functions.
We do understand that food can play a role in helping to provide the essential nutrition that the brain needs.
私たちは1980年代からエッセンスオブチキンという伝統健康食品の研究を続けてきました。
Recently, we discovered a bioactive peptide called propaptogen. It has the capability of regulating the serotonin system in the brain, thereby leading to enhancement of cognitive functions like memory.
The human brain has amazed and baffled people throughout the ages, and this discovery is a small but positive step towards understanding how brain food can enhance our cognitive functions.
Won the lawsuit.
The verdict is in.
I don't want this lawsuit. I never did want it. My father says things that are outlandish, quite often not true.
All I'm asking for is what's mine.
American Chopper, tomorrow night on Discovery Channel.
A colorful February just for you. Feel the colors of life in Indonesia. Be inspired by the colors of fashion. Be aware of the darkness. Color your life only on Sensasi.
By the 14th of February, the Japanese had captured most of the Empire forces' ammunition and fuel and had control of Singapore's main water supplies. That night, the Japanese entered the outskirts of the city. Hand-to-hand street fighting in the midst of the civilian population became a terrifying possibility. General Percival cabled High Command, seeking permission to surrender. Churchill realized the time for public bravado was over, and the next morning cabled Percival, permitting him to be the sole judge of the moment. On Sunday the 15th of February, 1942, more than 100 years after the British had raised their flag over Singapore, Percival surrendered unconditionally.
Incredible. We couldn't understand why and how or anything else. It was just impossible to comprehend.
Surrender was terrible. To think that here was the great British Empire and they had to surrender to these so-and-sos. I was very near broken-hearted.
We couldn't believe it. When the surrender came, we just put a shell up each end of the gun, blew it to pieces.
We thought the British would fight to the end and still protect this country, but we were disappointed. That really gave us a very poor opinion of the British.
So それはもう万歳します。はい。そして明日からはもう日本の天下だという晴れ晴らしい気持ちで入場いわゆる市街に入りました。
In Japan, the victory was seen as the first step in banishing the colonial powers from the region and confirming Japan as the rightful steward of Asia.
日本はもう大変な喜びになるわけですね。日本中がとにかくその勝利に酔いしれるというそういう状態だったんですね。東南アジアで最大の欧米の拠点だと思ってましたからそれを日本が、陥落させたということによって東南アジアにおける日本のイニシアチブができる。
It's impossible to overrate the shock that the fall of Singapore inflicted on the British people. They'd been told it was a fortress. There was this great British army there, up against a load of pathetic little Japanese midgets. And it was going to be defended to the last man. This was going to be a heroic imperial saga. But suddenly they see this huge imperial army surrendering to these despised Orientals, to the Japanese, and they were stunned.
The news of the fall of Singapore shocks the Western world. It's headline news, of course, in Britain, Australia, New Zealand, because for 50 years, Europeans had invested a huge amount in building up this bastion of European supremacy in Asia, and in a stroke, it's gone.
In limbo between surrender and capture, pockets of British troops, struggling to accept the colony had fallen, tried to put on a brave face.
A soldier came along and said, "It's all over. We've given up." And we had a bit of a sing-song, a lot of British patriotic songs. Britannia rules the waves. Just something to keep our mind off from what we're not sure was going to happen to us. I was only 17. Would the Japanese take me away from my parents? Would they shoot me? I was brought up in a convent to love one another, to live peacefully with each other. And here we are, fighting with each other and killing each other for what? Why? What was wrong with the world?
For those who surrendered in Singapore, what lay ahead was over 3 years in captivity. 30,000 British, 15,000 Australian, and 40,000 Indian troops joined the 30,000 POWs already taken in Malaya. General Percival stuck by his men and went with them into the hell of the prison camps. Even though he'd led his army to a humiliating defeat, Percival would retain the respect of his men. But among the local Singaporeans, what little respect remained for the Empire forces would quickly be dispelled. The Japanese marched the defeated Commonwealth troops through the centre of Singapore towards Changi Prison.
It was to really impress on the local population. Don't mess with us. Look at your previous masters. They've been defeated by us and they're of no use at all. They couldn't protect you.
The Japanese knew the Indians wanted the British out of India. So on February the 17th, they assembled 40,000 Indian soldiers from the Empire forces at Farrer Park Racecourse in Singapore. Mohan Singh, the Indian National Army leader, set about persuading them to join the Japanese to fight for independence in India. In an extraordinary display of anti-colonial zeal, some 20,000 Indians turned their backs on over 200 years of history and abandoned loyalty to their British king.
That moment at the racecourse when so many Indian soldiers declare for the Japanese is a sign that European empires in Asia have numbered days.
The Indians who had deserted the British now became the jailers of the former masters.
50% of them, I think, deserted and swapped straight over and were kowtowing down to the Japanese. In fact, it was those unmentionables that the Japanese put in charge of Changi, the main prisoner of war camp. And if they didn't like you, they just lashed out with the butt of a rifle.
Any expectations the prisoners of war had that they would be humanely treated by the Japanese were soon shattered.
To make the world's first 1,000-yard AK.
These will be going out to our boys that are serving overseas.
There's a good reason why nobody's ever done a 1,000-yard AK.
Sons of Guns, tomorrow night on Discovery Channel.
Join host Dave Mordal as he goes in search of the most ingenious, dangerous and dubious things people do to kill time.
What do you guys do for fun around here?
Adventurers, fanatics, enthusiasts, and the just plain crazy. You'll meet them all here on Recreation Nation, Thursday nights on TLC.
If teaching is my first love, then traveling is a close second. I'm not content with just being another armchair geographer. I love to be in nature, the solitude of the trail, the shade of the trees, the familiar smell of earth. So being a geography teacher is like a perfect marriage. I can continue to learn more about what I love and at the same time share this passion with my students. You know what I always look up for? The spark in my students' eyes. When I see the spark, that's when I know something within them has changed. Hopefully one day, they will go on to pursue their dreams with the same fervor as I did for mine. As our curriculum evolves, I'm glad that I can now take my students further. It is these students whose lives I hope to inspire that keeps me going as a teacher. Remember, teaching is my first love.
Up next, a pilgrimage to confront a war memory. The former prisoners of war return to witness the demolition of the prison that once made their lives hell. Sayonara Changi, coming up next.
The occupying Japanese army treated the Chinese in Singapore brutally. 3 days after the surrender, they rounded up any they considered hostile.
今度は自動車乗せられて何キロか山の奥へ入ってってね穴掘れ言うんです。2メートル2メートルに5メートルの穴掘れで深さは2メートル以上で何人で掘れ言ってよくトラックへ乗せたものを地方の人間を乗せたのに連れてくる憲兵隊から連れてくるんですよ。ぐるっと並ばせるんです。兵隊もそれぞれで剣をつけてぐるっと並ぶ。将校の人が高いところがあったってそれをぐるっと並べてねつけん。
In scenes recalling the brutality of the invasion of China, an estimated 50,000 Chinese Singaporeans were executed by the Japanese.
There was a real massacre. There was this infamous Sukching purification. You know, it meant really kind of a purification campaign. You think of course of the more recent term, ethnic cleansing.
いやもういうことをしたもんじゃの戦争言わないけんもんじゃのいうことを分かります。それで水が溜まって死体があるのに そんな鉛筆で泥をかけて手が出てきたらそれのね殴りながら泣きながらやる。刺激出た兵隊も泣きながら戦争言わないけんな思います。
For 3 years after the fall of Singapore, war raged in the Pacific. At its peak in 1942, the Japanese Empire extended over 20 million square miles. Its land conquests were a third greater than Germany's. In Malaya and Singapore, the Japanese had a local population of nearly 5 million under their control. The Japanese had promised the Malays independence, but it never came. Instead, they increasingly behaved like a harsh new colonial power.
Every time you saw a Japanese soldier, you have to bow down properly. If not done properly, you're beaten up.
The ill treatment and brutality extended to the hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war, who by mid-1945 were languishing in the camps, reduced to a pitiful state by enforced labour. Some POWs were taken to prison camps in the south of Japan to work in coal mines.
When we got to Japan, I was the soup cook in the prison camp. We were in the kitchen. We had to cook a meal for 400 men and have it ready at 0830 hours. Now, Bert Kelly, Welshman, was the rice cook, and all at once the most beautiful white light seemed to come in like stage smoke, float up Bert's body, met at the top of his head and formed into a silver halo. And I thought, we're dead, because you don't get your halo down here. Then we looked up, and just rising above the horizon was this odd-shaped, mushroom-shaped cloud.
開けたらですね、まあこの世の中にこんなのがあるかというようなひどいもんですよ。もう裸でですね、赤くただれたような人間じゃなくてですね、もう肉の塊ですね。そりゃひどいもんですよ。こんなことがね、この世の中であっていいかと思ったですね。まああれを見た時にですね、これが戦争だということには思わなかったですね。これ地獄だと思ったんですよ。
3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito surrendered unconditionally. In the Philippines, Lieutenant General Percival, who'd survived the horrors of the prison camps, met up with General Yamashita one more time when he surrendered. Yamashita would be tried for war crimes and hanged. On the 12th of September 1945, the British returned to Singapore. It was the Japanese turn to be marched through the streets in front of the locals.
As soon as the people saw the Japanese, went around the corner of High Street towards City Hall. In one voice they shouted, "Bagero! Bagero!" Bagero means bloody fool. Japanese, they used to call us Bagero before beating us, you know.
There was a great crowd from the Chinese community. They wanted to get to them, but they were held back. We were allowed to dance and sing, and we went out in the street where the Japanese were taken away, and we let our hair down. That was when I realized that we were really free. Well, that's what we thought anyway.
After the Japanese surrendered, all the old colonial powers returned to reclaim their colonies. But for the people of Southeast Asia, things had changed.
Now this time, the attitude towards the British was not like before the war. There were no more big masters. We thought it's high time that we rule our own country. So this spirit of independence almost in everyone's heart.
The British too seemed to have had a change of heart. With independence in the wind, they were losing their appetite for empire.
Thoughtful British people recognised that certainly India was bound to go, that it wasn't sustainable, and probably that the Asian Empire had to go too. A new generation of British people were much more realistic. They realised that the day of empires was done.
It would take another 14 years. But finally, in 1959, Cambridge law graduate Lee Kuan Yew became Singapore's first native-born Prime Minister. By now, all the old Southeast Asian colonies had been set free. Malaya, the Philippines, India, Burma, Indonesia, and Indochina had all gained independence since the Japanese lit the fuse in 1942.
Some Japanese claimed that this was their intention from the very start. That Japan was the light of Asia, would be the liberator of Asia.
純粋なその独立支援という面から言うとやっぱり問題があります。まあかなり日本にとって都合よく独立運動を助けるということですから、まあ本当そのなんていうか戦後の理想的な独立国家を作るための手助けというそういうように言い切れないんですけどね。
You treat human beings like human beings, whether they're yellow, brown, black or white, they deserve to be treated as such. And the colonials that I have met in the process in Malaya gave me the answer. That's why we don't have any empire now.
Once the essential hollowness of the empire, the great illusion on which it was founded, this great wedding cake which collapsed so readily when it was pushed, then the people of Asia saw that they had a different destiny and that their imperial masters were not what they had for so long supposed them to be. And maybe that did the British a favour as well as the peoples of Asia.
The fall of Singapore has become a shorthand symbol for a huge swathe of history. In the battle for Singapore and Malaya, 15,000 soldiers and 60,000 civilians from more than 10 nationalities gave their lives. It was not only Britain's most humiliating defeat, but was the tipping point that led to the end of colonialism throughout the world and changed Southeast Asia forever.
The withdrawal of Britain from Singapore, the withdrawal of France from Indochina, the withdrawal of the European powers throughout Asia led to a void that would be filled with something better, with something that would be their own. And so Singapore then became a symbol for a new kind of Asia. If the age of European imperialism began with Columbus's voyage in 1492 to America, then it ended in 1942 with the fall of Singapore.